Donald Trump has a new problem, and his name is Mitt Romney. And judging by their exchanges today, Donald Trump fears Mitt Romney a lot more than Mitt Romney fears Donald Trump. Most senators become famous after they are elected to the United States Senate. It's the Senate that makes them famous, but some arrive in the Senate already famous, like younger brother of the President of the United States, Ted Kennedy, Harvard professor and former UN ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan, former New York Knicks basketball star Bill Bradley, and, of course, former First Lady Hillary Clinton. The traditional advice for the big stars of the freshman class in the Senate is to stay quiet at the beginning. Try to convince your fellow senators that you're there to do the work of the Senate, not just there seeking more attention. Mitt Romney is the most famous freshman senator we've seen in a while. He is the first freshman senator in history who was the nominee of his party in a presidential campaign. Important footnote here. I know you're all thinking about Hubert Humphrey, who was also elected to the United States Senate after losing a presidential election as the Democratic nominee. But Hubert Humphrey had served 15 years in the Senate before becoming Lyndon Johnson's vice president and then the Democratic nominee for president in 1968. And so technically, Humphrey was not considered a freshman senator when he returned to the Senate. Mitt Romney ignored the tradition of famous freshman senators staying quiet, and he did it in a way that we have never seen before. He didn't even wait to be sworn in as a senator. He didn't wait for his first speech on the floor of the United States Senate. He wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post attacking Donald Trump's character, saying that Donald Trump does not have the essential qualities of honesty and integrity that Mitt Romney believes a president must have. And Donald Trump showed just how afraid of Mitt Romney he is in his response. There was no wild Twitter attack. The president, who does not know the meaning of the word team player, simply said that he hopes Mitt Romney will be a team player.
So with Mitt Romney, I'd love him to be a team player.
Mitt Romney attacked Donald Trump in even stronger language when Donald Trump was on his way to winning the Republican nomination for president. Then Mitt Romney did not vote for Donald Trump for president. He voted for the woman. Mitt Romney says he wrote in the name of the woman he is married to, Ann Romney, on the ballot for president of the United States. And now Mitt Romney attacks Donald Trump's character. And all Donald Trump has to say is, I hope he'll be a team player. That is what Donald Trump sounds like when he is afraid. Mitt Romney has just been elected to a 6-year term. Mitt Romney is going to be a senator longer than Donald Trump is going to be president. Mitt Romney owes Donald Trump nothing. And Mitt Romney owes Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell nothing. And one poll shows that 64% of Mitt Romney's extremely Republican state of Utah sent Mitt Romney to Washington to stand up to Donald Trump. And today, Mitt Romney said that he currently has no intention of running for president in Republican primaries against Donald Trump, but he's waiting to see who does.
I haven't decided who I'm going to endorse in 2020. I'm going to wait and see what the alternatives are.
Joining us now, David Frum, senior editor for The Atlantic, and Jonathan Capehart, Pulitzer Prize-winning opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. And Jonathan, I want you to put your Republican hat on. You worked for Republican Mayor of New York Mike Bloomberg when he was campaigning. So you've been inside what I would call the reasonable side of the Republican Party, where men like Mitt Romney have spent a lot of time. Certainly as a Massachusetts governor, that's where he was. Hard to tell much difference between Romney as a Massachusetts governor, Mike Bloomberg as a New York City mayor in policy terms. Your reaction to what you saw Romney do today and what you think it means for a senator like him who's now elected to a 6-year term and doesn't have to worry about being primaried next year in what is Donald Trump's party?
Well, I think you raise a very good point, Lawrence, when you say that Mitt Romney doesn't owe anything to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, doesn't owe anything to President Trump, which gives him a certain amount of freedom that a lot of the other Republican senators he's about to join don't have. The other thing is we will now find out, starting tomorrow, once he's sworn in, what he's going to do to marry these expressions of contempt for the president and for contempt for the president's moral character, both in the op-ed in the Washington Post and in a speech that he did a few months or so back, also lambasting the president, whether he's going to marry that to actual action where he, as a sitting senator, will criticize the president, maybe vote against the president on something that the president wants. That is going to be the key thing, because the one thing we can't forget about Mitt Romney, he's no revolutionary. He's no bomb thrower. He's not someone who is going to go out there and, race to the ramparts. He's looking for order. He's looking for a way to go back to the way things used to be when we had a president who was a moral exemplar for the country. And I don't know if Mitt Romney is going to go so far as to be out there every day clubbing the president about the head over his moral failings.
Well, David, Mitt Romney said in his op-ed piece basically that he wasn't going to be out there every day clubbing the president. He was going to vote with the president when he agreed with the president. He was not going to vote with the president when he doesn't agree with the president, and he wasn't going to comment on every tweet. But we know in the Trump cycle of outrageous behavior, there is a point once every fortnight. It might not be once every tweet, but once every fortnight, there is something truly outrageous that the microphone will be put in front of Mitt Romney when he gets off that elevator in the Senate office buildings, and he's going to have to say something.
Well, your question shows why this op-ed was so powerful and so astute. One of the problems that the more dissident Republican senators have had is they get whipsawed. That Jeff Flake will say this, and then he'll be barraged by questions. You said this, so why didn't you do the following 87 things? Mitt Romney has put down at the beginning his markers. I'm not going to pretend like Paul Ryan that I don't read the tweets. I'm telling you in advance, I'm not going to talk about them. I'm telling you in advance, I am reserving my commentary for signal moments, for the Charlottesville moments, when the president steps so far out of the bounds because otherwise I'm going to be constantly responding to every tweet every morning. Mitt Romney's also made it clear, don't ask me, am I going to oppose every nomination of the president's? I'm going to support most of them. I'm a Republican, and when he is in line with party teaching and party tradition, don't look to me to show my dislike for him by not voting like a Republican. So he's training expectations. And what he's doing is he's setting up a series of rendezvous with destiny in the near future, where when he does speak, and most of the time he won't, that speech will be ever more powerful precisely because it was so planned and so disciplined.
And Jonathan, one thing we don't know yet is what committee assignments is Mitt Romney going to have, because that's a very important forum for disagreement with a president. And we've seen it through the ages within the party. That's really the forum. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for example, is the forum where the Democratic senatorial opposition to the Vietnam War began. Eugene McCarthy was a member of that committee. He ended up running against the Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who was waging the Vietnam War. And so those committee positions are the places where we often see the most important criticism of a president.
Right, you're right. And we're talking about a particular president who has a lot of acting secretaries and acting people in positions that are going to need Senate confirmation. And so depending on which committees Senator, soon-to-be Senator Romney sits on, we will get to see those moments where he is questioning the nominee, where he is putting them through their paces to see if they are qualified to be in the positions that they're in. That will be one test to see how Mitt Romney, Senator Romney, challenges President Trump. But then the next hurdle is going to be, how does he vote in the end on the floor? And my hunch is, and maybe David will disagree with me, but my hunch is that when push comes to shove, if the nominee is on paper is qualified to be in the position, I don't see someone like a Senator Romney who is all about order and respect for the institutions, denying a president, leave aside who the president is, but denying a president his nominee for a particular cabinet position.
I think you would see Senator Romney voting for a Justice Kavanaugh, but against a prospect of an Attorney General Whitaker. He is going to act like a Republican, and people who watch him, especially on the station, need to understand you cannot ask him to be different from who he is. But President Trump today put down a marker that is, I think, a real klaxon, especially for Republicans. At the end of his, or in the middle of his cabinet session today, he delivered an endorsement of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And not only did he, the thing that was so remarkable with that is not only did he endorse it, but he endorsed it in terms that only someone who is really listening very closely to the way today's Russia talks about then Soviet Union would know. In a way that very few people, someone who doesn't follow the news closely like President Trump, would do, and yet he picked up on the false Russian claim that the invasion then happened as a response to terrorism. I think you're going to see Romney at his most effective when he is speaking up for traditional Republican views, especially on foreign policy, against a president who's going to be under fire because of the questions, is this president's foreign policy view driven by compromise?
Go ahead, Jonathan, quickly.
Yeah, real quickly, on the loyalty piece, because you played that before, the president saying, I hope he's a team player.
Team player.
You know, he's hoping Romney is going to be loyal to him. But again, these nice words that he said about Romney, we know they're not going to last very long.
Jonathan Capehart and David Frum, thank you for joining us on our first episode of Senator Romney versus President Trump. There will be more. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.